At birth, there is no awareness of being separate, no self, no name, no language to shape experience into identity. The infant lives in sensation, hunger, warmth, sound. All of it immediate, all of it undivided. What we later call self has not yet emerged. There is only response. Freud described the earliest mind as dominated by the id, pure impulse, untouched by reason. A primitive core that knows only need and seeks only relief. But as the child encounters the limits of the world, the ego begins to form. Not through insight, through frustration. The breast doesn't come on demand. The mother turns away. The cry isn't answered. The child learns. Desire does not always result in satisfaction. And from that tension, a structure begins to take shape. The ego is that structure, a negotiation, a strategy, a compromise between what we want and what the world allows. It adapts, it masks, it edits the self for safety. Over time, this adaptation solidifies into identity. The child learns words, learns his name, repeats it, associates it with approval. The word becomes a container, and soon the child begins to live inside that container. Jacques Lacan described this process as the mirror stage. A child, confronted with its own reflection, mistakes the image for the self. The ego is born at that moment, a fiction that feels whole, a surface that hides the fragmentation beneath. It is here that the divide between appearance and reality begins. The child imitates what brings praise, avoids what brings shame. Every reaction from the world becomes a thread in the fabric of identity. I am quiet. I am clever. I am bad. I am lovable. These are not truths. These are echoes. The ego collects them, arranges them, performs them. It learns the faces others like to see and makes them its own. As the ego strengthens, it forgets that it was ever constructed. The child who once lived in presence begins to live in reaction. Every interaction becomes a mirror. Every mirror returns a version of the self that must be accepted, rejected, or improved. School reinforces it. Success becomes a measure of worth. Mistakes feel like identity failures. You are smart. You are lazy. You are special. You are a disappointment. These statements do not describe behavior. They assign value. The ego absorbs them and builds a mask from the pieces. Søren Kierkegaard saw this clearly. He wrote of a man who wears a public face so convincingly, even he forgets it is a performance. And when that mask begins to crack, he feels despair. Kierkegaard called this despair the sickness unto death, not the fear of dying, but the fear of never having truly lived. The ego, Kierkegaard believed, is terrified of freedom, because freedom demands authenticity, and authenticity requires something the ego cannot offer: silence, a stepping back from performance, a confrontation with a raw, unedited self. But the ego clings to structure. It wants identity to be fixed, reliable, admired. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this as a form of slavery. He called it herd morality, the tendency to shrink the self to fit within the comfort of social norms. Become who you are, he said, a paradox, because to become who you are, you must first dismantle who you've been told to be. This dismantling terrifies the ego because it believes it is real. It confuses survival with truth, and so it resists change. It wants consistency. It wants to be right. It wants control. But the world doesn't care about control. And the self beneath the ego, the one that observes all this, is not made stronger by control, but by letting go. Once the ego is formed, Its first instinct is to defend itself. The world is unpredictable. Control is limited. So the ego begins to build stories. It says, "This is who I am. This is what I deserve. This is how people should treat me." These narratives become armor. They shield the identity from contradiction. But over time, the armor becomes the prison. Carl Jung warned of this, that the ego, when left unchecked, begins to see itself as the totality of the self. It resists the unconscious. It fears what lies beneath. Because to face what's hidden would mean admitting that the mask is incomplete. The ego copes through comparison. It measures itself against others, hoping to find validation. Social media, status, appearance, intellect, all become tools for constructing an image. Not an image of truth, an image of control. But comparison is a game with no finish line. For every victory, another standard appears. For every compliment, the fear of losing it grows stronger. And so the ego becomes reactive, easily bruised, quick to defend, addicted to praise, allergic to criticism. This tension breeds suffering, quiet, constant. Not the kind that makes you cry out, but the kind that makes you feel empty even when everything seems fine. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and survivor of Auschwitz, saw how dangerous it was to base identity on roles, status, or approval. He said, "When a man cannot find meaning, he distracts himself with pleasure." The ego does just that. It looks outward for validation because it has forgotten how to look inward without fear. It clings to certainty because it dreads silence, and so it grows louder, more opinions, more judgment, more identity. But underneath it all, the self waits. The original self, the one that was there before the performance began, the one that doesn't need to be seen to exist. Sooner or later, something breaks. A failure, a loss, a moment of betrayal. Something shatters the image the ego works so hard to protect. And in that silence, the silence after the mask falls, a question rises. If I am not who I thought I was, then who am I? Jung called this moment confrontation with the shadow. The parts of the psyche the ego rejected, fear, envy, weakness, desire, come rushing back in. Not as enemies, as messengers. The ego sees these parts as threats, but the deeper self knows they are keys. The Buddhists call this process ego death. Not the end of the self, the end of identification with it. Alan Watts described the ego as a hallucination, a social convention mistaken for reality. Ramana Maharshi, the Indian sage, offered a simple path. Ask the question, who am I? Not to get an answer, to notice the silence that follows. Because beneath the layers of opinion, reaction, memory, and ambition, there is something that watches, something that doesn't need to win, doesn't need to be right, it simply observes. That observing presence is what remains when the ego begins to fall apart. And strangely, it is during these collapses, these unravelings, that people often report a kind of peace. Not because they've figured everything out, but because they've stopped pretending. The performance pauses, the roles dissolve, and what's left is simple, still. Some call it awareness, others soul. It doesn't ask for attention, it simply waits. And the more we listen, the more we see how loud the ego truly was. How much of our suffering came not from the world, but from the story we told ourselves about needing to be someone. The ego is not an enemy. It was built to protect you, to navigate a world that demanded performance. It worked hard to keep you safe. But safety is not the same as truth. The ego deals in image, in reputation, control, and defense. The self beneath the ego deals in reality. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Awareness is not the destruction of the ego. It's the recognition that you are not limited to it. Lao Tzu described it with fewer words. When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be. To live without being ruled by the ego is not to erase your name or your voice or your desires. It is to hold them loosely. It is to speak without needing to be admired, to act without needing to win, to feel without needing to be seen. Jiddu Krishnamurti taught that freedom is not found in escaping the self, but in observing it without judgment. To see the ego arise, in envy, in fear, in pride, and not be pulled into its drama. That is the beginning of something deeper, something steady, something real, not an idea of who you are, a quiet knowing beneath the idea. You were here before the story, before the name, before the mirror told you what to believe. That self is not fragile. It has no image to protect, no audience to impress, only presence. The ego will still speak. It always does. But when you know it for what it is, a voice, not a master, then its power softens. You begin to choose, not to impress, not to defend, but to live. That is where the ego ends and the self begins again.